The night of June 5th, 1944, was unnaturally quiet along the Caen Canal in Normandy. A thin mist hung over the water. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the concrete pilings of the bridge, and the occasional croak of frogs in the marshy ground nearby. In the pillbox on the western bank, Gefreiter Werner Kortenhaus, 43 years old and conscripted from a factory job in Stuttgart, checked his watch. 20 minutes past midnight, 4 hours until his shift ended. The bridge itself was a utilitarian thing, 150 meters of steel and concrete spanning the canal, vital for moving troops and supplies between Caen and the coast. But to the 50-odd men defending it, mostly older soldiers and conscripts deemed unfit for the Eastern Front, it was simply another night of garrison duty in what everyone assured them was a quiet sector. The real war was in Russia, in Italy, anywhere but here. In the cafe beside the bridge, the Gondry family huddled in their cellar. Georges Gondry, the proprietor, had sent his wife, Thérèse, and their 2 young daughters down there hours ago. He'd been passing information to the resistance for months now, watching the German defensive preparations, counting the soldiers, noting their routines. Tonight felt different somehow. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. 3,000 feet above the channel. 3,000 feet above the channel, Major John Howard, 30 years old, sat in the lead Horsa glider, his stomach tight with anticipation. Behind him, 28 men of D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry sat in silence, their faces blackened with camouflage cream. They'd rehearsed this operation so many times that every man could perform his role in complete darkness, which was fortunate, because that's exactly what they were about to do. The Halifax bomber, released its tow rope at precisely 16 minutes past midnight. The sudden silence as the engines fell away was absolute. Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, the pilot, could hear his own breathing as he pushed the glider's nose down, aiming for a landing zone he couldn't see, guided only by his stopwatch and the landmarks he'd memorized from aerial photographs. 47 meters from the bridge. That was his target, land 47 meters from the bridge. Kortenhaus heard it first. In the German pillbox, Kortenhaus heard it first. A strange rushing sound like wind through trees, except there were no trees nearby, and the night was still. He stepped outside, peering into the darkness. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Something was moving through the air, something big, descending fast. "What's this, Das?" he called out, his voice uncertain. "What is that?" The glider appeared. The Horsa glider materialized out of the darkness like a monstrous bird, its wings black against the slightly lighter sky. It hit the ground with a tremendous crash, the wooden fuselage splintering, the nose tearing away completely, the sound of rending timber and screaming metal shattering the night's quiet. Kortenhaus stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The glider skidded across the grass, throwing up dirt and stones, slewing sideways, coming to rest so close to the bridge that its wingtip nearly touched the metal railings. 47 meters. Walwork had hit his mark almost exactly. 3 seconds of silence. For perhaps 3 seconds, there was silence. Then the side door of the glider burst open and men poured out, moving with practiced speed despite the violent landing. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, 26 years old, was first out, his Sten gun already up, already firing. Behind him came his platoon, 28 men who'd trained for 6 months for this single moment. Fallschirmjäger. In the pillbox, Kortenhaus finally found his voice. Fallschirmjäger, he screamed. Paratroopers! But even as he shouted the warning, he knew something was wrong. Paratroopers came from the sky, floating down on silk canopies. These men had arrived in a glider, and they were already on top of the bridge, already moving, already killing. The assault, the machine gun in the pillbox opened fire, tracers arcing across the bridge, but the British were already too close, using the bridge's own structure for cover. Grenades came flying through the pillbox's firing slit, and Kortenhaus threw himself backward, his ears ringing from the explosions, his eyes watering from the acrid smoke. Two more gliders crashed down in quick succession, one landing in the marsh with a tremendous splash, the other skidding to a halt near a pond. More British soldiers emerged, moving with the same terrifying speed and purpose. The Germans defending the eastern side of the bridge found themselves under assault from multiple directions simultaneously, with no time to organize, no time to think, barely time to react. Obergefreiter Heinz Hickman, Obergefreiter Heinz Hickman, a 38-year-old former postal worker from Hamburg, had been sleeping in a bunker 50 meters from the bridge when the first glider landed. The crash woke him, and he stumbled outside, still half asleep, trying to understand the chaos erupting around him. He saw British soldiers running across the bridge, the muzzle flashes of their weapons, heard the screams of wounded men. Englander! He shouted to the men behind him, Englander! But by the time he'd gotten his rifle to his shoulder, the British were already past the bridge's midpoint, already clearing the pillboxes on the far side. 10 minutes. The entire assault, from landing to bridge capture, would take less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes to seize an objective the Germans had spent months fortifying. In the Gondre's cellar, in the café, Gondre's cellar, Thérèse held her daughters close as the sounds of battle raged above them. Explosions, gunfire, shouting in German and English. She whispered prayers in French, wondering if they would survive the night, wondering if liberation had finally come, or if this was just another raid that would bring terrible reprisals. Lieutenant Brotheridge. On the bridge itself, Lieutenant Brotheridge led the charge toward the eastern bank, firing as he ran. A German machine gun position opened up from a trench near the café, and Brotheridge went down, hit in the neck. He would die minutes later, the first Allied soldier killed on D-Day, having led his men across the bridge he'd been sent to capture, but his men kept moving. Sergeant Wagger Thornton. Sergeant Wagger Thornton took over, leading the assault on the remaining German positions. The British moved with a speed and violence that overwhelmed the defenders. These weren't garrison troops used to easy duty. These were elite light infantry, trained specifically for this mission, moving through the darkness with absolute confidence. Kortenhaus surrenders. Kortenhaus, his ears still ringing from the grenade explosions, crawled out of the damaged pillbox to find British soldiers already consolidating their positions. A young man, barely 20 years old by the look of him, pointed a Sten gun at his chest. Hände hoch! The British soldier shouted in terrible German, hands up! Kortenhaus raised his hands, noting absurdly that the British soldier looked as terrified as he felt. The boy's hands were shaking, his breathing rapid, his eyes wide. But the gun never wavered. More prisoners. More German soldiers emerged from their positions, hands raised, some wounded, all shocked. They'd been told the Allies would come eventually, but they had expected warning naval bombardment time to prepare, not this sudden appearance out of the night sky. not this overwhelming violence delivered in complete silence until the very last second. Hickman, as prisoner Hickman, found himself herded together with a dozen other prisoners near the western bank. A British officer, the one who'd led the assault, was organizing his men with calm efficiency, sending some to establish defensive positions, others to check the bridge for demolition charges. The officer's face was blackened with camouflage cream, making his eyes seem unnaturally white in the darkness. "Sprechen Sie English? Sprechen Sie English?" the officer asked. "Do you speak English?" One of the prisoners, a young man named Carl Schumann, who'd worked as a translator before the war, nodded hesitantly. He was 24, conscripted 2 years earlier, assigned to this quiet sector because of his poor eyesight. "Tell them," the officer said, speaking slowly, "that if they cooperate, they will not be harmed. Tell them we are British paratroopers, and this is the beginning of the invasion of France. Tell them the war is over for them." Schumann translated, his voice shaking. Some of the German prisoners looked relieved. Others looked stunned, unable to process what they were hearing. The invasion? Here? Now? Without warning? Major John Howard, having emerged from his glider with nothing worse than bruises, moved among his men, checking casualties, ensuring the bridge was secure. 2 of his men were dead, including Brotheridge, and several were wounded. But the bridge was taken, intact, ready for the tanks that would come later. He pulled out his radio and sent the success signal, ham and jam, the password that meant both bridges were captured. German Regimental Headquarters. At the German Regimental Headquarters in Ranville, 3 kilometers away, the duty officer received the first confused reports. A bridge under attack. Gliders. British soldiers. The officer, a captain named Klaus Haller, tried to make sense of the information. Gliders? How many? Where exactly? He began making phone calls, trying to organize a counterattack. But in the confusion and darkness, it would take time to mobilize troops, time to understand what was happening. Back at the bridge, Kortenhaus sat with his fellow prisoners, watching the British soldiers dig in, preparing for the counterattack they all knew would come. One of the British soldiers offered him a cigarette. Kortenhaus took it with trembling hands, noting that the soldier was young enough to be his son. "Warum?" Kortenhaus asked quietly. Why? The British soldier didn't understand German, but he seemed to grasp the question. He pointed east toward the coast and made a sweeping gesture with his hand. Invasion. The word needed no translation. Hickman's relief, Hickman, sitting nearby, felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with his fear. He'd been conscripted, forced to leave his postal route in Hamburg, sent to France to defend a bridge he'd never cared about for a cause he'd stopped believing in years ago. Now it was over. He would survive. He would eventually go home. The thought was almost overwhelming. Schumann, the translator, found himself pressed into service by the British. They needed him to interrogate the prisoners, to find out about German dispositions, reinforcements, defensive plans. He answered their questions truthfully, seeing no reason to protect information that would only get more men killed. The British officer, Major Howard, treated him with surprising courtesy, offering him tea from a thermos, speaking to him as one educated man to another. "You speak excellent English," Howard said. "Where did you learn?" "University," Schumann replied. "Before the war, I studied literature. What did you read?" Dickens, Hardy, Shakespeare. Howard smiled, a strange expression given the circumstances, given that two of his men lay dead nearby. "My wife teaches English literature," he said. "She'd like you." The staff car, the surreal conversation was interrupted by the sound of engines. A German staff car was approaching from the east, its driver apparently unaware that the bridge had been captured. British soldiers let it get close, then opened fire. The car swerved, crashed into a ditch. The occupants stumbled out, hands raised, joining the growing group of prisoners. One of them was a Major Hans Schmidt, the officer nominally in command of the bridge's defenses. He'd been in Ranville attending to administrative matters when the attack came. Now he stood before Howard, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation. Schmidt's interrogation through Schumann. Howard asked him about German reinforcements, defensive positions, communication systems. Schmidt refused to answer at first, citing his duty as an officer. But when Howard pointed out that the invasion was clearly beginning, nothing Schmidt could say would change the outcome. Cooperation might save lives on both sides. Schmidt's resistance crumbled. He was 52 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and he was tired. "We expected you to come," Schmidt said through Schumann, "but not like this. Not in the night, not in gliders. We expected bombardment, naval guns, landing craft on the beaches. We expected warning." "That was rather the point," Howard said dryly. "More prisoners." As the night wore on, more German prisoners were brought in. Some were defiant, some were relieved, some were simply confused. A group of Polish conscripts, forced into Wehrmacht service, were openly happy to surrender, speaking to each other in rapid Polish, smiling despite their circumstances. Friedrich Müller, one young German soldier, barely 18 years old, couldn't stop crying. His name was Friedrich Müller, and he'd been drafted 6 months earlier, sent to France after the briefest training. He'd never fired his rifle in combat before tonight, and when the British had come charging out of the darkness, he'd frozen, unable to move, unable to think. Now he sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking, while older prisoners tried to comfort him. "I want to go home," he kept saying. "I just want to go home." A British sergeant, hearing the boy's distress, even without understanding the words, brought him water and a blanket. The sergeant was perhaps 22 himself, not much older than Müller, but he moved with the confidence of a veteran. He said something in English, his tone gentle, and Müller looked up, not understanding the words, but understanding the kindness. Kortenhaus's realization, Kortenhaus watched these interactions with a growing sense of unreality. He'd been told the British were brutal, that they would shoot prisoners, that they showed no mercy. But these men, these paratroopers who'd appeared out of the night and captured the bridge in minutes, were treating their prisoners with surprising decency. They were professional, efficient, but not cruel. "They're just soldiers," he said quietly to Hickman, "like us. Just soldiers doing their jobs." "Better trained, though." Hickman nodded. "Much better trained." The training, that was undeniable. The speed and coordination of the British assault had been remarkable. Every man had known exactly what to do, exactly where to go. There had been no hesitation, no confusion, just smooth execution of a well-rehearsed plan. It made the German defense look amateurish by comparison, which perhaps it had been. Dawn approaches. As dawn approached, the sound of heavy engines rumbled in the distance. German tanks, finally mobilizing for a counterattack. The British soldiers tensed, checking their weapons, preparing for the fight they knew was coming. The prisoners were moved to a more secure location, away from the bridge, while Howard's men readied their anti-tank weapons. Schumann's strange position. Schumann, still serving as translator, found himself in a strange position. He was a prisoner, but he was also useful, needed. He moved between the British and German prisoners, translating questions and answers, helping to prevent misunderstandings that might get someone killed. "What will happen to us?" one of the German prisoners asked him. "After the invasion?" Schumann had no answer. Prison camps, probably. Years of captivity. But compared to dying on the Eastern Front, compared to the meat grinder of the war's final battles, it didn't seem like the worst fate. The counterattack. The expected German counterattack came at dawn. Tanks and infantry moving toward the bridge. But by then, British reinforcements were arriving, paratroopers from the main drop zones linking up with Howard's force anti-tank guns being positioned. The balance of forces was shifting rapidly. From their position away from the bridge, the German prisoners could hear the battle but not see it. The sound of tank guns, the rattle of machine guns, the crump of mortars. It went on for hours, a confused melee in the early morning light. But the bridge held. The British held. The bagpipes. By mid-afternoon, the sound of bagpipes drifted across the bridge. Lord Lovat's commandos were arriving from Sword Beach, having fought their way inland. Piper Bill Millen marched across the bridge playing blue bonnets over the border, a surreal sound amid the carnage of war. The link-up between the seaborne and airborne forces was complete. Kortenhaus breaks. Kortenhaus, hearing the bagpipes, felt something inside him break. It was over. Not just the battle for the bridge, but the war itself. At least for him. The Allies were ashore. They were moving inland, and nothing was going to stop them now. He'd known it intellectually since the moment that first glider had appeared out of the darkness, but now he felt it emotionally. Germany had lost. In the Café Gondry. In the Café Gondry, Thérèse emerged from the cellar to find British soldiers in her café. Major Howard, ever the gentleman, apologized for the intrusion and the damage. Thérèse, realizing that liberation had truly come, that her family had survived, burst into tears. She brought out bottles of champagne she'd hidden from the Germans, bottles saved for exactly this moment, and shared them with the British soldiers who had freed her home. The march to prison camps. The German prisoners were marched away later that day, beginning their journey to POW camps in England. As they walked, they passed British troops moving inland, an endless stream of men and vehicles, the might of the Allied invasion rolling forward. Some of the prisoners looked at this display of force with despair. Others looked with a kind of relief. The war would end now. Surely it had to end. Schumann's thoughts. Schumann, walking in the column of prisoners, thought about his conversation with Major Howard, about literature and wives, and the strange civility that could exist even in the midst of war. Kortenhaus's memories. Kortenhaus thought about the young British soldier who'd pointed a gun at him with shaking hands, the sergeant who'd given a blanket to a crying German boy, the piper who'd played his bagpipes on a bridge that had been bought with blood. After the war years later, after the war, Schumann would write about that night, about the sound of the gliders coming out of the darkness, about the speed and violence of the assault, about the strange kindness of the captors toward the captured. He would write about how war revealed both the worst and the best in people, sometimes in the same moment, sometimes in the same person. Kortenhaus returns home. Kortenhaus would return to his factory job in Stuttgart, would rebuild his life in a devastated Germany, would rarely speak of his war experiences, but sometimes, on quiet nights, he would remember. The sound of that glider appearing out of nowhere, the terrible crashing landing, the British soldiers emerging with such speed and purpose, the young soldier with the shaking hands, the cigarette shared in the darkness. The moment he realized the war was over for him, Hickman's new life. Hickman would go home to Hamburg to find his city in ruins, his postal route obliterated by bombing. He would help rebuild, would carry mail again through streets that were slowly recovering, and he would tell his children, when they were old enough to understand, that he had been captured on D-Day at a bridge in Normandy, and that the British soldiers who captured him had treated him with unexpected decency. Friedrich Müller's journey. Friedrich Müller, the crying boy, would spend 3 years in a POW camp in England, would learn English, would eventually immigrate to America after the war. He would build a new life there, would rarely speak of his brief, terrifying experience as a German soldier, but he would never forget the British sergeant who'd brought him water and a blanket when he was at his lowest point, who'd shown him kindness when he expected none. Howard's returns. And Major John Howard would return to Pegasus Bridge many times after the war, would attend reunions and commemorations, would meet some of the German soldiers who defended it. They would shake hands, these old enemies, would share memories of that night, would marvel at how young they'd all been, how much history had turned on those 10 minutes of violence in the darkness. The bridge, today, the bridge itself would become a symbol, a monument to the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. Renamed Pegasus Bridge after the winged horse emblem of the British Airborne Forces, it would stand as a reminder of the moment when the liberation of Western Europe began, when men dropped from the sky in wooden gliders and changed the course of history. That night, but on that night, in those first confused moments after the landing, the German defenders had no sense of history or symbolism. They had only confusion and fear, the shock of sudden violence, the realization that the quiet sector was quiet no more. They had shouted warnings in the darkness, had fought briefly against overwhelming odds, had surrendered to an enemy who turned out to be not the monsters of propaganda, but simply soldiers, young men doing their duty, professional and efficient, but not unnecessarily cruel. Was ist das? Was ist das? Kortenhaus had shouted when he first heard the glider. What is that? It was the beginning of the end. It was history arriving in the night, without warning, without mercy, but also without unnecessary cruelty. It was war in its purest form, violent and terrifying, but ultimately human. It was the moment when the long road to victory began, bought with the lives of men like Den Brotheridge, secured by the courage of men like John Howard, witnessed by men like Werner Kortenhaus, who would carry the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. The bridge still stands. The bridge still stands today, though the original was replaced and moved to a museum. But the site remains, marked and remembered, a place where history can almost be felt in the air. And sometimes, on quiet nights, you can almost hear the sound of gliders coming out of the darkness, the shouts of men in German and English, the beginning of the end of the longest night of the 20th century. Conclusion. If this story of courage and fear, of soldiers on both sides doing their duty, of a bridge that changed history, has moved you. Subscribe to Frontline America, World War II right now. Hit that like button and share this with anyone who wants to understand what the German defenders experienced when British gliders came out of the darkness. Drop a comment. How would you have reacted in Kortenhaus's position? And where in the world are you watching from? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.